Well, howdy and welcome to our discussion of a quantitative research article. The article that you see in front of you is entitled Hourly Employee Retention in Small and Medium Attractions, the Central Florida Example. So this article is available to you online in our class, so if you haven't already found it, you might go ahead and download it so that you can follow along and maybe take some notes as we talk about it. This is a pretty simple little piece of research that was done, and I want to talk to you about some elements of it and how it relates to several things you're going to be doing later on in the semester. So the first thing let's talk about is the fact that, again, it looks like every other research article that we've kind of looked at in class, which is it has the title, then the author, followed by the abstract. So by definition, the abstract is a summary of what has been done in the research. My suggestion is when you write a abstract that you actually write it last, because then you can reflect on back on what you have actually already done. But some of the elements of the abstract you might see here: objective of the research, some information about the data collection, and that would include numbers of subjects, who were the subjects, so what criterion was there for them to be in the study, what did the subjects do in terms of, in this case, they filled out a questionnaire, how was the data collected, so that would be procedural types of things, and then a very short summary of the findings. When you do write your research proposals for me, you will be writing an abstract. Obviously, because you're only in the proposal stages for me, you will not be reflecting on any findings or results, nor discussion or conclusions. When you write for Dr. Gundy in your internship, that's when you would fill that in. So when you write for me, you're only talking about what you're going to do. Now the next section deals with the kind of the background information for the study, and he has it entitled Introduction. And the thing that I would say about the introduction is, if you can picture in your head an upside down triangle. So most triangles, the base is at the bottom and the tip is toward the top. Well, either literally draw that in a notebook or on a piece of paper and flip it the other way so that the base is up at the top of the page and the tip is going toward the bottom of the page, because that's how I want you to think of writing a good introduction. Good introduction should start out very broadly, and then as you continue to write the introduction, you more narrowly focus the review of literature. And so we're going to take a look at this introduction and talk a little bit about it, and I think there's some things in here that'll be really easy for you to understand and will be helpful when you go to write your introduction. So the first thing I want you to do, and you probably need to pause the video just for a second, because I want you to go through the introduction and read only the first sentence of each paragraph. So pause the video and go through and read the first sentence of each paragraph. So you should have stopped the video and read the first sentence in each paragraph. And I think if you did that, and probably what I should have you do is, instead of just read the first sentence, actually write out the first sentence. But I think he does a pretty nice job of actually starting out very broadly with some background information and then narrowing his focus to the problem of his study. So let's just take a look at a handful, not necessarily all of the first sentences, but the first sentence starts with, the employment market in the U.S. has gone through remarkable transformations in the past 2 decades. Can you get more broad than that? Other than the fact he's talking about the United States, he's talking about employment, the fact that it's gotten transformed. Very, 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 very broad statement. And then when you look into the paragraph, he starts talking about things like good jobs and workers' fears and 21st century in the United States and unemployment. If you go down to the next sentence or paragraph, he starts talking about the tourism and hospitality industry. So he's still talking about U.S., still talking about employees, but now he's focusing us a little bit more on the area where he's going to look at his research and collect his data. If you keep going, he starts talking a little bit about the hourly employees. And again, if you go back and you think about how or what is this overall study looking at, it's hourly employees in the uh, entertainment and the small amusement park arena. So keep going. They did some, or he provides a little bit of information about employee turnover. So trying to retain hourly employees is always an issue for employers. Again, he's focusing now back on amusement parks. Again, keeping going, talking about amusement parks and turnover, amusement parks. Now he starts talking about a little bit more specific information about turnover and retention. And I'm not going to sit and read all of this to you, but I know one of the things, because I've talked to people in the like actually food service industry where a lot of workers are hourly, retention and turnover is a huge problem, very costly to individuals. So he's got a nice bit of information about employee turnover. And let's keep going. And you see we get to the next section, methodology. And right at the end of the methodology, or last two paragraphs are really important. The first thing I'll point out is that the second to the last paragraph is what is the objective of this study. So if you think about the upside down triangle, the literature started out very broadly, and then it narrowed our focus, and to the point where he presents his statement of the problem or purpose of the study. Now the last paragraph is really also important because he talks about there his operational definitions of terms. So what does he mean by an hourly employee? What does he mean by employee turnover? What does he mean by small and medium amusement park and attraction facilities? So that last paragraph is really important because he operationally defines many of the terms that he's going to be using in this study. So let's move on to the methodology. Now, as good as I think that his introduction is, I think his method section to me leaves a little to be desired. The typical sections of a methodology section are the subjects or the participants, the instrument, and the procedures. So the subject section talks about who were your subjects, what were the criterion for their selection, how did you select them, how many of them were there, and then in this case, or typically in the past tense, you'll give some demographic information about ages and genders and races and that type of thing. Typically, the instrument section talks about the questionnaire itself, how many items did it have, how is it scored, what did it measure, how do you interpret the score, what was the scale of the score, so like a Likert scale, those types of things. And then lastly, the procedures are the information about how the data was actually collected. So were individuals brought into a room to fill out the survey, were the survey sent out individually via email, anything procedurally about how the data was actually collected. If in fact the researcher is manipulating something, so method A of teaching versus method B, a very rich description of what is method A, how many hours were they trained, how many days a week were they trained, what went into the training versus method B. So what I would suggest to you is that this is not a great method section. I think if you read the whole thing you can find all of the elements of that, but it certainly is not outlined how I would have outlined it. So it starts out with the fact they were at 13 facilities, Central Florida, amusement parks and attractions. It does give a pretty good idea of about the instrument, but he didn't talk about how it was scored, who wrote it, how did they find it. So there's several things that they probably left out there. What he calls data collection, I would have probably called procedures. Maybe talk about a couple other things in here. The first one is that he talks about they randomly selected the subjects. I believe it's either chapter 4 or 5 in our textbook talks about data collection in terms of subject selection. So one of the things that your chapter talks about is random selection. The thing he doesn't do in here is talk about how did he random select the subjects. It could have just been the first 25 that walked in on a particular day, and in his view that may have been random versus our view where we know that random selection truly is every person in the population has an equal chance of being selected. So I would question how he uses the term randomly. I would also point out to you the proportionality. What this indicates is that the facilities that had larger numbers of employees were expected to gather more information, give out more surveys. Those that were at smaller facilities gave out a proportionally smaller number of surveys. So that was something that is, I would say, a pretty good thing. And then the last thing I'll point out here is he only got about 39% of the surveys back. So they gave out right at 450, got back right at 175. So to me that would be a criticism of the study. One of the things that you always look for as a researcher and a reader of research is the limitations of a study. Limitations of the study are the weaknesses of the study. So I would say that that's probably a pretty big weakness of this particular study. While we're here and talking about methods, let's talk a little bit too about delimitations. Delimitations are the fences that you put around the study. So it's the who are your subjects? It's what are you measuring? So delimitations are very closely tied to the methodology section. So in here, this study is delimited to hourly employees at small and medium attractions in Central Florida. It's delimited to the data that they collected using this particular instrument. So delimitations are very much related to your methodology. Some of the things, though, that could be delimitations are if you were looking at stress, you're delimiting your study to studying stress measured in a particular way. So are you measuring it with a paper and pencil test, or are you measuring it with some sort of physical assessment? So delimitations, who are your subjects, what are you measuring, how are you measuring it, what are your procedures? So let's talk a little bit about some of the findings. And one of the things that you do need to recognize, and this is from one of the previous chapters in your book, is that there are different types of research questions. Basically, there are demographic questions, there are relationship questions, and there are difference questions. Descriptive questions just do exactly what it says. They describe. What are people's attitudes? If you've had me before, you may have heard me talk about the need for a fall break at Texas A&M. So what are the attitude of Aggie students toward a fall break at Texas A&M? And you would sample some people, find out what they say, and it may be that 75% want a fall break. So that's that's descriptive in nature, just describing how people think. Relationship questions deal with strength of association, so the correlation between two items, and so you would think about them being assessed using the Pearson correlation coefficient. If you can think back to your statistics class. And then the last one is difference questions. Difference questions look at differences between groups. So is method A different from method B? Are males different from females? And so the statistical test that actually gets done there is a t-test. So a lot of times in this article in particular, he didn't actually provide any research questions for us, but we can figure out the type of question based on the results, and that's what we're getting ready to look at. So if you think about descriptive types of questions, those are typically going to be answered with frequency data, percentage data, means, and standard deviations. And we said this just a few moments ago, strength of association questions or correlation questions are going to be answered using Pearson R, And then difference questions are going to be answered using independent or dependent t-test. So if we look at the first couple of paragraphs and the findings, what you'll see is a lot of percentages. I don't see any means in there just at first glance. But what this tells you is that these are answering descriptive types of questions. So if you just look at the, here's an average. Respondents participating study worked at their attractions an average of 3.5 years, medium 2 to 4 years. So there's an average. Had responsibilities in a variety of areas, mainly the guest relations, so here's some percentages. So all of these are just describing, in this case, the participants. So they're answering descriptive questions. So the next section deals with the job search. So you can read through and look for a couple of things that might be interesting to you. You know, over a third found out about the job from someone who was employed there. Here's table 1 that gives a lot of the demographic information, and that's a nice table that summarizes a lot of the data. Again, you can look at the both of these tables and see you've got percentages, means, standard deviations, medians. So all of these are answering descriptive types of questions. Here's where people work, sources of information used by the respondents. So we're going to kind of zip through the next several tables because what you would see is that there's a lot of percentage data here. So all of that is descriptive. Now the next section looks like we have some questions that were asked on a Likert scale, this 5-point Likert scale, where 1 indicated strong agreement and 5 indicated, 1 indicated strong disagreement, 5 indicated strong agreement. So here we're going to probably see some averages, and so the next paragraph appears that most of the respondents agreed that their job responsibilities were very clear to them. The average score was 4.5. So again, still answering descriptive types of questions. And if we look at the next paragraph, we'll see that. And let's move on down through. So we're seeing more and more means. So still looking at descriptive. Looks like they changed the Likert scale to where 1 indicated unimportant, 5 indicated important. So again, a table that gives lots of information, some level of importance, and some employment characteristics. Again, lots of means and standard deviations, etc. Until we get right here. So here is our first example of something other than a descriptive question. So Pearson correlation revealed that, and I'll let you read the rest of that sentence on your own, but this tells you that they're looking at the strength of association between variables. So let's look at that first sentence. Employees who had worked more hours per week attributed higher importance levels to health benefits. So here's the correlation between hours worked and importance of health benefits. And just as a quick reminder, remember that positive correlations mean that as one variable goes up, the other variable goes up. Down here we'll see some negative correlation coefficients, which mean as one variable goes up, the other goes down. So negative correlations down here. Now this next paragraph deals with t-tests. So here we're talking about differences between groups. So if you read this, it looks like they're looking at differences in gender. So t-test analysis revealed that females attached significantly higher importance to levels of company policies. Now, make a note in your head that when you see t-tests, or when t-tests are used, typically if there is significant differences, or if there are significant differences, after that you'll get some indication of an average score for one or the other group. So when you see means, you need to read further to see, is that dealing with just descriptive information, or is it giving me the outcome after, in this case, a t-test. So you can see there were several questions they answered that were difference questions. This last one looks like we went back to some percentages, so we're back to our descriptive questions. Down here we got some more Pearson correlations, so we're looking at strength of association between continuous variables. A lot more correlation, some more averages it looks like, so here's some means and standard deviations. Some more correlation stuff. And then lastly we get to the conclusions. So again, a typical quantitative article is going to start out with a title, the author, abstract, some sort of introduction, and introduction and review of literature. Should be formatted kind of in an upside down nature, so that at the very end of it you have the statement of the problem, and in this case they did provide you, because they felt like they needed to, some operational definitions. Next section should be the methodology section. Typically you're going to see participants, instrument, and then procedures, information for all that. And then the next section deals with the results. Again, quite often with the purpose they will provide you with their hypotheses, but sometimes you have to look at their hypotheses or their research questions, the type, based on how they present the data. So again, descriptive, correlational or strength of association, and difference questions. And then after that you will typically find conclusions. Now a lot of times during research or the collection of research data, problems arise in the study. So it could be things like lots of people drop out, or the researcher finds out that a lot of the employees are talking to each other about the research, and so they decide, hey, we're going to give answers that are not maybe as honest as we should. If a researcher finds a problem during the course of a study, again, that's probably considered a weakness or a limitation, and the researcher should point that out. And typically if that happens, it will be in this discussion or conclusion section. And as I recall, he doesn't really talk about any of those, so there must not have been any. But quite often in research papers you will see the author actually talk about a particular limitation of the study that they knew of. Again, as a reader of research, as you kind of go through the semester and learn more and more about research, you're going to also be able to criticize research. So some things that you would always look at are things like we just talked about a few moments ago, things like return rates, were the subjects selected randomly versus them being volunteers or versus them being paid. And those are not necessarily bad things, but they are potential problems, and you could say that there are criticisms of research. The last thing on here again is his references. You're going to always see that at the end of a research paper. Again, I'll say a few things about the APA. There are elements that you see here that are in APA, and I will say that there are elements that are not. So do not take this as, well, here's an example of APA. For example, I can tell you for sure that nothing in APA is blue, and sometimes we see things coming in, or I'll see things in paper, items that are blue or underlined, and neither of those is correct.